Ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich. So a very warm welcome to this event, to the Ludwik Fleck lecture this year to be given by Professor Dr. Gabriel Motzkin. I will introduce him in a minute. My name is Hartmut von Sass. I'm the, in a way, the host, since I'm the Vice Director of the Collegium Helveticum and the leader of one of its satellite, as we used to say, the Ludwik Fleck Center. Before coming to be introducing Mr. Motzkin, I will lose some words on the Ludwik Fleck Center and the Ludwik Fleck himself. Obviously, the Fleck Center is named after the Polish microbiologist Ludwik Fleck. He was born in 1896 and died in Israel in 1961. He is considered to be one of the pioneers of modern philosophy of science and modern research to science or into science, and he is very well known for some of sort of neologisms such as Denkstil, thought style, or Denkkollektiv, thought collective, you might say. So notions that underline the social dimension of the development of knowledge. Nevertheless, the monograph he published in 1935 in Basel, original title reads Entstehung und Entwicklung einer wissenschaftlichen Tatsache, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, was unnoticed for decades. It was not published earlier in English than in 1979 in Chicago, and it was not until Thomas Kuhn, who was born in Cincinnati, and I just came back this morning from Cincinnati, published a brief tribute to Fleck in the preface to The Structure of Scientific Revolution, one of the classics of philosophy of science, published in Chicago in 1962. And from then on, things changed a bit, but successively for the reception of Fleck's work. The Ludwik Fleck Center, however, is a forum for the study of Ludwik Fleck's work, life, and ideas, drawing on Fleck's view on realism and constructivism. I mean, dangerous labels, as it were. The center also explores general problems in the philosophy of science and its psychology, or psychology and sociology. And consequently, the Ludwik Fleck Center supports and documents the assessment of Ludwik Fleck's importance, growing importance, you might say, to the history of philosophy and science in general, while also promoting projects in the field of epistemology and the history of science in the broader context. Former lecturers include Carlo Ginzburg from Pisa, Eva Jablonka from the Cohen Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas in Tel Aviv. And she presented together with Dr. Marian Lamp from Birkbeck College, University of London, and also the Spanish writer and author George Seprun. We are very delighted to be able to welcome warmly Professor Motzkin. He is currently the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, an institute that has some, to put it in Wittgensteinian terms, family resemblances to the Collegium Helveticum. The Van Leer Jerusalem Institute is an intellectual center for the interdisciplinary study and discussion of issues related to philosophy, science, society, culture, and education. And the aims, as I learned, are described as follows: to be an incubator for innovative ideas in the humanities and social sciences, to promote humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, to define and shape the public discourse, and to point out alternative ways of thinking about current topics. Professor Motzkin is an emeritus professor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he held there the Ahad Aham Chair in Philosophy, but he was also simultaneously member of the departments of History and German Literature. Gabriel Motzkin has served as a dean of the Faculty of Humanities and was the director of the Franz Rosenzweig Center for German, Jewish Literature and Cultural History for many years. And Professor Motzkin had various fellowships, and to name but a few, he was fellow at the Siemens Foundation, the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Science. He was at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge. He was a fellow at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, the Wiener Institute at Tel Aviv University, and the Max Planck Institute for History, and also the Wissenschaftskolleg, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin. He had been a visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and the University of Gießen. Was held visiting positions also at the University of Amsterdam and Constance, and was also at the Cardozo School of Law at the Yeshiva University, which is, I think, right in the middle of Manhattan. His fields of interest create a truly explosive mixture, I would say. The philosophy of history, the secularization theory, if this exists at all anymore, cognitive science, memory theory, and Martin Heidegger. We will pursue as follows. Professor Motzkin will give his lecture, and we will have then time to debate and to discuss. And afterwards we have a dinner, and all the official people are invited, but you are warmly welcome to join us. But now we hear Professor Motzkin's talk. It has the almost paradoxical title, Extracting Meaning from the Past and the Future, the Philosophy of Science and the Philosophy of History Compared. Thanks for coming, and we are very delighted to have you here.
Put this down?
Yeah.
That way I don't have to stand up. Ich werde meinen Vortrag auf Englisch halten. Ich bitte Entschuldigung, aber ich bin bereit, dann die Diskussion auf Deutsch zu führen. Okay, so everybody knows that the philosophy of science is not science. But not everybody knows that the philosophy of history is not history. That is because we have a clearer idea about what science is than we do about what is history. Namely, history can either mean what happened, or it can mean what we write about it. We know that what happened and what we write about it is not the same, but we still use the same word for both. In science, it is a different story. What we write about science, when we write science, are laws or predictions for how particles or cells behave. Our laws and predictions are also not the particles themselves, but they are both closer to and further from the objects described than is the case for history. Namely, with the exception of quantum physics, a scientific rule is usually not part of the behavior of the particles themselves. So in that sense, it is further away from its object, whereas an historical text can be, and sometimes is, part of the historical process itself. On the other hand, science predicts how its objects will behave, and history makes no such predictive claim. In this predictive sense, science is closer to its objects. The question arises of whether either the philosophy of history or the philosophy of science is closer to the objects than are historical science and natural science. I'm going to repeat that sentence so it's clear. I make a big distinction between the philosophy of history and history, and I make a big distinction between the philosophy of science and science. So when I say Geschichtsphilosophie or Naturwissenschaftsphilosophie, I don't, Naturwissenschaftstheorie, I don't mean Naturwissenschaft or Geschichtswissenschaft. Just so put the philosophies on one side and the empirical disciplines on the other. The term objects here can be understood in two different ways. First, as the objects or events in nature or history. Second, as the objects of the philosophy of history or the philosophy of science as disciplines. It may or may not be that the disciplines are closer to their objects. But the more far-reaching claim would be either that the philosophy of history is closer to history than is historical science itself, or, here's another extreme claim, that the philosophy of science is closer to the particles and cells than the natural sciences themselves. While this last claim may be patently absurd for science, it is not absurd for history. The claim can and has been made that the philosophy of history is closer to to historical events than is historical science itself. Hegel thought that the philosophy of history expresses the worldview of an age, unlike historical science, which is just the research of a past worldview that is no longer current. Thus, the philosophy of science and the philosophy of history can be viewed as inverse disciplines. If the purpose of the philosophy of science is to extract meaning from science, which itself is debatable, then it must ask what is the meaning of the predictions that scientists make. Instead, much philosophy of science is devoted to analyzing the validity of scientific claims and to analyzing the methods by which science proceeds. Scientists tend to view both these pursuits with disdain, perhaps because they require no clarification with respect either to their methods or to the validity of their claims. Perhaps, however, there may be another reason. Maybe this. The question is how to extract meaning from science, which means extracting meaning from scientific predictions. Now, this question also has two aspects, that of the metaphysical meaning of science and the question of what we should do if we think something is going to happen, because the scientists have told us. Thus, global warming, for example, is queried with respect to its validity, but few people raise the question of whether global warming is desirable or undesirable. In part, this is because global warming is obviously harmful for some and beneficial for others. But that also raises the question of our standards. Are we to view scientific predictions only through the lenses of material improvements, or can some further meaning be extracted from such scientific predictions? In an analogous manner, the philosophy of history can serve as an analysis of the practice of historians, or it can serve as a means of extracting the meaning of historical events. While a philosopher of history does not need to predict anything, she is conscious that she is analyzing the past, and therefore the meaning of events can be viewed variously as analyzing the short-term meaning of events or the long-term meaning of events. Each has its place. Consider two maps, one a local map and the other the map of the continent. If we want to know where we are, the detailed map will prove more useful. If we want to understand the shape of the continent or our relation to a faraway city, we must necessarily employ a larger map with less detailed resolution. In other words, even with something as continuous as space, we ask different questions with respect to a close focus and to a more distant focus. Moreover, it does not help us to assert that we can break up a continent or stitch it together from small details. We keep asking different questions with respect to different maps, questions that are inherently discontinuous. We often ignore this discontinuity with respect to the past, but we also tend to ignore it with respect to the future. With respect to the future, we might have better reasons. First, we do not really have available a long-term horizon with respect to the future. If I were to say, as a politician, that I'm doing something which will return a collective profit even in the relatively short space of 1,000 years, people would deem my position to be ridiculous. When we talk about global warming, we usually talk in terms of 50 or 100 years, and even that time span seems to be beyond the imagination of most people. In our experience, the past has a more complicated structure than the future. There are three pasts that we experience. There is the past that we have lived, which is partially accessible to our memory. There is the past of the people whom we have known, and perhaps also of those whom they have known. This is the past about which we can relate personal anecdotes, stories about things that happened to others. Finally, there's only the past which is accessible. There's the past which is only accessible with the aid of written texts. This past is no different from the prehistoric past, for we discover this past from a position of ignorance, and we learn about it through books and relics. Whether the world was created 4,000 years ago or 4 billion years ago is interesting, but it has little effect on how I navigate the world. History and the philosophy of history deal with this third past, which means that they are either about text or about a logic of events which we reconstruct from text. This reconstructed past is not accessible through experiment. We cannot really ever be certain of why and how things happened in the way that they did. This past is the story of how contingency becomes necessity, about how events that did not have to happen become faits accomplis. We have many theories about why things had to have happened in the way that they did. But we all know that we cannot predict what will happen in our own lives, and we must be able to think that this lack of predictability also determined the lives of past people. That result has complex consequences for the philosophy of history. It would lead to the conclusion, at the extreme, that there was no working class before people began to think about a working class, or at least to the attenuated conclusion that the working class was not historically significant before it allegedly began to act as a self-conscious agent. Now try this. In turn, that conclusion would either mean that women did not exist before feminism, or that one cannot speak of a history of women before women began to act collectively as women on the historical stage. Such conclusions offend our common sense. And it is our common sense that makes us treat social formations as existing before they are self-conscious. On the other hand, common sense is a very poor guide to science, and even particles cannot be said to have a definite position before we measure them. Either we then believe that human history is more determinate than nature, or we believe that a certain fictionality adheres to any collective categories that we can employ. From our point of view, a set of people does not behave like a set of particles. The question, however, is whether sets of people are more contingent or more determinate through being complex assemblies of particles. Our conclusion will have to be, that both are true. Sets of people are both more contingent and more determinate than particles. On the other hand, we assume that sets of people already have positions before we encounter or measure them. On the other hand, we accord to sets of people a greater degree of freedom with respect to the future than we accord to particles that have already been measured. That means that we arrive at the surprising conclusion that historical action is both more determined and at the same time also freer than the behavior of particles in nature. Now, it could be argued that this paradoxical result is reached not because of the failure of our historical or of our human categories, but because of the failure of our scientific categories. This argument turns on the idea that determination and freedom are not originally categories inherent in nature, but categories that have been imported into nature because it is an important question about people whether they are free or whether they are determined. It is the particle that is measured by a human being that has a fixed position. For all we know, you, Everett, may have been right, and the particles may split into a very large number of particles in a very large number of universes at the same time. You know, this is the theory by which there's no problem with quantum measurement because everything goes into 10 to the 600th universes. And it's, I won't go on about it now. That sounds again like the particle is determined. But it may also be that determinacy and indeterminacy do not really characterize the principles of the trajectories of particles. These are our categories that we import into measuring the particles. Since we know so little about nature, it is difficult to import principles from the natural sciences to the analysis of history. However, we cannot do history without raising questions of contingency and determinacy. Again, it may be that history happens without these questions, although that is hard to conceive given that we are dealing with a history of human beings. The point is that it is not clear whether our concern with contingency and determinacy is merely a historical concern, or is it rather a general human concern? While I only know something about a few cultures, it seems to me that the question of responsibility for action, which is what contingency and determinacy are really about, is a general human concern, and that one cannot respond to that question without having some conception of the relation between human choice and its limits. Thus, the question of contingency and determinacy is not only a scientific question with which we analyze the past, it is also an ethical concern. The study of the past cannot be historically predictive, but it can be ethically prescriptive, so long as we realize that making the past relevant for the future means taking it out of the realm of science and transforming it into principles for action which themselves are no longer based in the study of the past. In other words, a detachment occurs in the transition from history to ethics, which makes it impossible to form an ethical prediction. On the other hand, one cannot do one of two opposite things. First, one cannot mine history for ethical content, since that turns history into a morality play, which it is not. Second, one cannot regard the past from a purely scientific point of view, since it is then not clear which question we wish to answer. That is the difference between description and experiment. If one only has description available, one can always answer the how questions, but one cannot answer the why questions, just as in biology one can answer the question of how something evolved, but it is often quite difficult to ask the question of why it evolved or the specific circumstances in which it evolved. It's very hard to reason back from something in evolution to the contextual conditions under which that trait evolved. So history is then neither ethics nor science. At the same time, we have a sense in which our experience is contingent upon the existence of history. For otherwise, each generation would have to recommence all processes de novo. The point is that our appreciation of history cannot be scientifically true, even though it is more necessary for us than our knowledge of scientific truth. That is a very important point. While I cannot live without some knowledge of nature, that knowledge, for instance, the knowledge of nature possessed by prehistoric humans, does not qualify as a science from our perspective. It is significant that history, i.e. the knowledge of the past and even the desire to know the past accurately, developed before the scientific study of nature. I would argue that the knowledge of history is essential for our functioning in the world. If we had no knowledge of history, we would not be able to have any conception of progress in our political, economic, or social arrangements. This argument does not mean, however, that because something is less necessary, it is less worthwhile. It's an important point. What is necessary is sometimes not very worthwhile. It may be that our greater knowledge of physics may be the greatest achievement of the past century. Surely, however, no one would argue that it makes much difference to our current lives to understand black holes or the future convergence of the Andromeda galaxy with our own. You know, this will happen in 5 billion years. That raises the question of the difference between historical truth and scientific truth. This issue is obscured by the phenomenon that there are different types of historical truth and of scientific truth. Some scientific truth can be similar to mathematical truth, i.e. truth that is true under all circumstances, in all possible worlds, and moreover that truth cannot be verified or demonstrated by experiment. Most scientific truth is, however, probabilistic. It states that there is a very high chance that something is the case, and hence it can be verified by experiment. The interest in such kinds of truth originates in the idea that the conclusions are reliable. In that sense, in our culture, probabilistic and experimental truths replace religion as a guide to the future. The transition to our modernity is then also the transition from a truth that is certain, because it is revealed, to a truth that is probable because it can be demonstratively repeated. It should be pointed out that the objectivity is not only situated in an external world, because such a truth, in order to be confirmed, needs to be repeated, and it is the experimenter who is repeating this truth. Unlike in philosophy and in mathematics, in history there are no statements that are true in all possible worlds. Indeed, there do exist kinds of possible worlds in history, for otherwise historians could not ponder contrary to fact situations. However, history is also neither experimental nor even probabilistic. It is easy to see that history is not experimental. It is less easy to understand that history is not probabilistic. The formal reason is that the choice of one probability for actualization makes it difficult to say anything about the range of options. However, the deeper reason is that a significant proportion of historical events are manifestly improbable. Retrospectively, we think that events could have been anticipated, and we praise those who guessed the future. But that praise conceals the point that those who predict the historical future have no way of quantifying their prediction. Franz Ferdinand might have survived the attack at Sarajevo. If he had, we don't know whether World War I would have broken out later, given that the greatest opponent of Austria going to war was none other than Franz Ferdinand himself. It was not foreordained that Hitler accede to power, nor that he have the opinions he did have. One might have been able to predict that some kind of authoritarian regime would obtain power in Germany, but it would have been difficult to specify which kind. Since no one could predict the lack of will of the Reichswehr, that's the German army, under the command of Hammerstein-Eckwold to stop Hitler. The comparison with Boulanger's attempted putsch in France in 1889 is instructive. Boulanger came within an hour of succeeding. Who knew that King Juan Carlos would stop the putschists in Spain? Certainly they did not anticipate the resistance of the king to a monarchist takeover. Each of these events had great consequences, and each of them could just as easily have taken a different turn. It is not only history that is improbable, so is evolution. Evolution consists in adaptation to circumstances as the basis for selection of the fittest. Each such adaptation characterizes a very small portion of the gene pool. Its success is measured by the degree and the rate by which it then spreads through the given gene pool. It thus turns out that what prospectively had a very small chance of occurring then becomes completely determinative for what was to follow. Our narrative of history is this narrative of retrospective probability. It means that the historical truth of something is whether we judge it to become determinative for what follows. Of course, that is a matter of interpretation, but few people are interested in the history of what has no effect on what happens. Thus, history is about how contingency becomes determinacy. This transformation turns out to be counterintuitive for many people. If something is determined, they reason, there must have been a moment of determination present at its origin. If something is purely contingent, how can that purely contingent event become determinative for a world which is always already determined? The reason they argue in this way is that they are unable to consider the transformation of contingency into determinacy in terms of the living observer's perspective. It is only from our assumed position in history as being ourselves after the event that we can regard the event as determinative. We cannot assess its prospective determination. We do not now know what would be the consequences of a Jacobite, they're still Jacobites, takeover of the throne in contemporary England, which we can assume is an event with a small probability. The Jacobite claimant is the King of Bavaria, but we don't think he's going to take over the throne in England. We are not even able to assess the consequences of such an event. You will notice that the more difficult question is rather how we can assess an event as being contingent. Many books have been written to show how World War I or the rise of Hitler became increasingly probable in their respective historical contexts, implying that these events become ever less contingent over time before they occur. In my opinion, we construct these narratives because we are already after the event. If contingency has scientific meaning, it means contingency at that specific time. That contingency is not quantifiable. Gavrilo Princip could have missed. That's the guy who was going to shoot Franz Ferdinand. Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckvold could have arrested Hitler. It follows that the aim of scientific truth and the aim of historical truth are completely different. The aim of scientific truth is to be true in every case. In Popper's view, one experiment that falsifies a given theory is sufficient to raise the question of the validity of that theory. That idea is comforting, for it means that we can rely on the validity of scientific truth. Perhaps actual scientists do not have that solace, for actual scientists know how uncertain is their own field and their own research. But we attribute to science the same comforting certainty that we used to ascribe to religion. On the other hand, the aim of historical truth is not at all to be true in every case. Historical truth's aim is to be true in only one case, i.e., the case of the event that is described. Thus, even if the event were a probable one, the nature of historical research is such that an event is first investigated in terms of its uniqueness, and only then is it embedded in a rhetoric of probability. The consequences can be seen in that the past is never strange from a scientific perspective, since particles are always assumed to behave the same way, or assumed to always behave in the same way, whereas historians always emphasize the strangeness of the past. Seen this way, historians are mystifiers. When we read the Bible, the conduct of the protagonists is never viewed as strange by the writers. It is the historical treatment of the biblical protagonists which attributes different motives to them than we have. Just as it is anthropologists who seek us to make us familiar with the notion that primitive tribes have a different mentality than we do. This is a contested assumption. The traditional view was that different people have different customs, but not that they have different minds. This strangeness is imported in order to weaken the strange uniqueness of the historical narrative. When we say that all Andaman Islanders believe thus and so, we are robbing them of their individuality and to some degree of their capacity to have a history. Everything becomes a consequence of their social structure and their mentality. This situation is made even worse by the circumstance that we are not really sure we even understand the supposititious mentality of theirs. We have, just like the historians, mystified the other by imposing on her our own value of cultural relativism, a mindset that claims to respect the other, but one which actually denigrates the other because it makes that other totally incomprehensible. When we view history as a story that seeks to find meaning in the sequence of events, we are then confronted by our unease that history is like a casino. This is a highly uncomfortable feeling which we seek to repress by finding a meaning in events. However, as I said, this meaning is entirely retrospective. I cannot know the meaning of events that have not yet occurred. History is then like a double casino. First, we do not know who will win or who will lose. Second, the values change all the time. If I bet $10 that the USA would defeat Germany in World War II and I would collect my bet, I would think that I then have $10. But the real truth is that the number engraved on this dollar bill changes every time I look at it. At one point it is worth $1 million, and at another point it is worth $1. Not only events are contingent, so are the retrospective values which we attach to them. Not only cannot we predict what will happen, we can also not predict how what will happen will be evaluated or judged. Yet that is not the whole story. Something about the past is determinate. We do not say that World War I never happened. We do not really think that because the communists erased people from photographs, those people never existed or were not there. What is retrospectively determinate is the facticity of events, but not their meaning. That conclusion leads us to an inverse aperçu. Going forward, we do not know if something will happen, but we know very well its meaning. We cannot engage in historical action unless we have a clear idea of the meaning of what we are doing. Thus, what happens in history is that we exchange meaning for facticity. People who fight wars usually have a clear idea of why they are fighting. Just go and ask them. It is afterwards that they are no longer sure about why they were fighting. This statement contradicts the usual point of view, according to which the meaning of an event is determined by its reception. While this theory may have some truth, it also means that the meaning of an event is also always changing. That may work for literary texts, but it does not really work for historical events. Luther knew very well what he was doing by tacking his 95 Theses on the church door. Napoleon understood very well what he was doing by invading Russia. The historical significance of these events may well be co-determined by their reception, but there always also exists an original meaning, which is the meaning of an event before it has occurred. Otherwise, people can't plan an assassination. Indeed, unless this meaning of an event that has not occurred cannot be elucidated, then no action at all would be historical action. That is a key difference between most of science and history. Even in quantum physics, where our measurement determines the position of the particle, what we are seeking to do is to measure the position or the velocity of the particle. It does not make sense to say that we imagine the particle before we measure it, because there is an epistemological gap between our imagination of measuring a particle and actually measuring a particle. You know, I dream of the particle and then I measure it, not the same thing. In history, the connection between imagining a course of action, such as managing a battle, and carrying it out seems to be much closer. That is because the burden of what might be called meaning in science is actually carried by the behavior of the particle. In contrast, the burden of the meaning of an historical event is shouldered at least as much by the intention as by the event itself. Clearly, I can imagine courses of action in relation to events upon which I never embark. However, the historical event is not independent of the intention of the protagonists. Historical action is not an experiment. It is not only historians who cannot rerun events. When agents act historically, they are actually changing the world. Therefore, historians need to pay as much attention to intentions as to their fulfillment. If that is true, then the difference between historical texts and historical actions is not the same as the difference between scientific texts and scientific results. Scientific texts are usually of two kinds. First, they report results of an experiment or a probe or some investigation. Second, in fields like mathematics, they assert what must be true under all conditions. Science has enough trouble bridging between its apodeictic and its experimental parts. Historical texts are different for many reasons. First, they depict the interaction between agents and causes, between people and the social or cultural conditions which encourage some courses of action over others. Second, they depict this process as a process by which an historical engagement is either affirmed or denied. What is confirmed or denied is not a fact, but the meaning process in which the fact is embedded. Third, historical texts also participate in the historical process itself. Not only do they seek to structure our collective memory, they also often seek to affect the course of action in our culture and society, whether it be through analyzing the Great Depression or introducing the reader to Myanmar. The fact that historical texts are embedded in a process of action makes them essentially different from scientific texts. We may be told to heed the danger of global warming, but we first want to know whether the science is correct. Thus, one conclusion must be that these two texts have a different relation to truth. Scientific texts claim to discover truth, while historical texts seek to show how humans make truth. Yet we must insert one caveat. Whether or not history is a part of science, science is a part of history. The historical claim to totality is such that it embraces both anti-historical views, for which history is meaningless, and a scientific understanding of the world, which may be based on non-historical principles. It follows that for humans, the principle of making truth is more universal than the principle of discovering truth. This conclusion is the opposite of that traditional philosophical view according to which the subjective making of truth is embedded in the objective truth, of which the sum is much greater than any individual truth. This conclusion means rather that the discovery of truth is also an event, and hence an historical event. If I find out or know today something that I did not know yesterday, I have minorly or majorly changed the world. That is, I have necessarily changed the natural world, but although that may also be true, I have not necessarily changed the natural world, but it is clear that I've changed the human or historical world. If I know more science, I've changed the human or historical world. In other words, science does not learn from history because the scope of science is more limited than the scope of history. Science cannot imagine the extent of the range of history, which in this sense is greater than the entire universe of nature. However, history can learn from science because of history's superior status, i.e. its power to generate reality. Now, this situation changes completely when it comes to the philosophy of science and the philosophy of history. Despite what we said at the beginning, the philosophy of history has a non-historical aspect as well as an historical aspect. Thus, the philosophy of history can make universal claims which both historical action and historical prediction can never do. In contrast, the philosophy of science is always more limited than science itself, either because it studies how scientists function, or because it does not claim to embrace scientific reality. That means that the philosophy of history is more universal than the philosophy of science, but unlike historical action, the philosophy of history does not claim to generate reality. Of course, this claim of not generating any reality is inherently self-contradictory, and it is for this reason that the philosophy of history can fall into disrepute. It follows that the relation between history and the philosophy of history is different from the relation between science and the philosophy of science, because the philosophy of history, unlike the philosophy of science, challenges the universality of history, perhaps invalidly. Here is where the philosophy of history and the philosophy of science not only can, but must enter into dialogue with each other, namely in their competing claims to universality. Here too, however, a true philosophy of history would win the competition, i.e. a philosophy of history that makes the robust case that it is more universal than a philosophy of science, just as making events is a more universal phenomenon than finding out about them. However, that means that we must have a typology of different genres or different kinds of universality, so that we can understand the difference between domains. Just as different universes in an alleged multiverse have different extents, some are big, some are small, so two different claims to universality have different extents. The extent of history is greater than science because it claims to include all the phenomena that enter awareness. History is a discipline that connects past events, whatever their kind. The extent of the philosophy of history is that it seeks to find the rules that govern all events and not just subsets of them. In this sense, the philosophy of history resembles physics. While the study of history is a study of the trajectory of particular linkages of events, the philosophy of history is oriented to universal rules. Since the sciences already include such rules, the philosophy of science is not oriented to finding out such universal necessary rules, but rather to finding out the rules for discovery or for justification. These are definitionally less universal from the scientific perspective than the science itself. The difference between science and history is that science studies both the events and the rules that govern these events, whereas history really only studies the events, leaving causality to probable and possible narrative, since history of itself can never make the claim that a particular causal change had to turn out the way it did. Thus, to the philosophy of history is assigned the perhaps vain task of seeking universal historical rules. Now, universal rules are never as universal as that of which they are the rules. There's always one more event, whether or not, whereas it may be that there is not one more rule. Why is all this of any consequence? Why should anybody pay any attention? First, making truth is a wider category than discovering truth. Second, all universalities are subsets of making truth. Hence, all universalities can be related as belonging to a common domain. History can learn from science because history is more universal than science. The question is whether the philosophy of science can learn from the philosophy of history, or whether the philosophy of history can learn from the philosophy of science. It is clear that the philosophy of history can learn from the philosophy of science because the philosophy of history is more universal than the philosophy of science. In other words, the more universal always learns from the less universal. It does not follow that the philosophy of history is more universal than science itself. Can, however, a less universal domain learn from a more universal domain? Can learning go from general to specific, or must it always go from the less general to the more general? We have made the case that learning surprisingly goes from the less general to the more general. The answer then must be that to learn from the more general to the less general is not the same thing. We are learning something essentially different, something which may in fact be helpful in considering our particular domain. What then is our advance? It is this. We have found out that the more universal, as it were, learns from the less universal. We have also found out that the difference between the more universal and the less universal is not just a quantitative difference, but a difference of kind. We can also conclude that learning itself as a phenomenon discloses to us the difference between ontological levels of consideration. And we have also found out that the criteria of making truth are not the criteria of discovering truth, namely because making truth always has an ethical dimension. Thank you.
All right. That's it. So thanks very much for this intriguing talk. We have time enough to discuss some of the issues that you mentioned, and so feel free to jump in and to challenge our speaker. Who's the first?
Das kann auch auf Deutsch gesagt werden. Das braucht nicht. In English, okay.
Should work now. Since we record this, you may. I don't know.
Speak to the mic is what he's telling you.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Sorry.
History as a discipline is anachronistic because we are talking about a past using the ideas and language that we have today. Doesn't that have a strong effect on how we can think about what history means?
I wouldn't say that. Look, historians devoted a great deal of energy to reconstructing the imaginative mentalities of the past and trying to come up with, Dilthey was famous for this, saying that the word table in the 16th century meant something different from what it means today, and we have to construct. They sort of became anthropologists of the past. What I was interested in, though, is something else, which is that in the world in which I grew up in, there were a lot of deterministic theories of human behavior. These were either Marxist or Freudian. Early traumas affected your life, and Marxism meant that you couldn't do any better because you were poor, so that's why you had to do whatever you did. Now, these theories were very attractive for a very long time, and we know, at least I do, we know that they can't be true. It's not that they aren't true. They can't be true because history is a congeries of very low probable events. Very low probable events. When I mean low probable events, I mean that you keep veering from one event that's 1 in 1,000 to the next event that's 1 in 1,000. And that then you connect them as some story which you're told, like, evolution is a story that winds up with human beings. Now, I was just reading a book by Nick Lane on biology where it turns out that all eukaryotes, that's us, emerge from one bacterium penetrating one archaea once in 2 billion years, and all multicellular organisms are a result, including all the plants, are a result of this one time coming together of these two organisms. Now, whether that is true or not, the fact that a biologist, who has a lab, does this, can even imagine such a low probability event, and I think history in that sense is like biology, means that we have to accept the fact that we cannot give adequate contextual explanations of why things happen. This leads me to another rant. So I'll respond with another rant to your question, which is that, and it's an important point, that people always say how the people in the past thought differently, just because they say that the Burmese and the Thai and the I don't know who, the Japanese all think differently. Well, they don't. They don't. And how do we know this? Because we know this because if you say, I would like some water, somebody in Burma or in Japan will know perfectly well what you want to say. 90% of the time, you're expressing yourself to the other person in a language that they understand perfectly well. Now, the person who proved this was a British anthropologist by Alfred Gell, who lived in primitive villages in Indonesia and India to find out whether this theory that Gurevich had about different conceptions of time in different cultures was an accurate one, and he found no. Everybody had the exact same conception of what tonight and tomorrow and everything else mean. In fact, there was a huge amount of time invariance. I think that's where is there a difference between cultures, and this is important for us. For instance, in the validity that we ascribe to dreams. That's really different for different cultures. You know, the validity we ascribe to dreams is something that's in some cultures, dreams are completely determinative. You know, there's a famous story about a guy in Brazil who walks up to another guy and says, "Pay me." And the other guy says, "Why?" And he says, "You stole some chickens from me last night." And the guy says, "No, I didn't." He says, "Well, I dreamt that you stole some chickens from me last night." So the guy pays him. So that's really different. So that's
Who's next? Any questions?
When taking an extreme scientific point of view, you make the distinction between particles and human beings, but of course a scientist might say human beings are part of nature, so they are different in kind from individual particles, but they are still objects in nature and obey the same rule. There is really no difference between history, let's say, of the evolution of the planetary system and the history of mankind. And in the example that you gave of an evolutionary event, I think one doesn't know whether what you say is what applies, because there's another point of view that such events happen recursively, and some of them are successful, others are not successful, and the successful survives. That theory is well known, right? So
I can answer that briefly because I think you're right. I don't make any distinction between, I don't see where I can make the distinction between evolution and history, except that evolution operates on both a larger and a smaller time scale. Larger because it's long periods, smaller because it deals with gene transfer and genetic drift, which occur faster than human action, actually. So I don't think that's the problem. But there is an issue about the idea that I can predict, and that's true of biology. It's not true of biology. I can't predict. But there is an issue about whether I can predict human behavior, and the answer is I can't. I just can't. And that's the main point. And I think that's an important point. It's not saying it's not part of nature. It's just saying that it's unpredictable. And it's unpredictable which way it goes. You see, it's not a consequence of my measuring it that it changes. It's unpredictable simply because of circumstances that I do not even understand. There is no way that I could predict the rise to power of Adolf Hitler to power, because on January 29th, he was not in power, and on January 30th, he was. And anybody could have stopped him on January 29th. Just needed this to switch it. And there is no way to quantify that. None.
But what you say is also happening in quantum mechanics. An individual event in quantum mechanics is unpredictable.
An individual event in quantum mechanics is unpredictable, except that when you measure one thing, then you can predict then you know you have determined it, no?
In retrospect, but that is true also in a historical fact. In retrospect, you can always find out what happened under certain circumstances.
I accept that.
In modern biology, or not so modern anymore, we have the observation of an effect that we call epigenesis.
Yes.
Now in plant biology, there's now a challenge for traditional evolutionary biology in that we see some Lamarckian traces in the evolution. So if that would be true for history as well, then the Lamarckian traces would have some inherited attitudes over the generations, and that would you give probably some terms of predictability.
Look, I see what the issue that you both raised is, and let me try to see if I can make another go at the previous question and at this one, which is that the question is that I'm predicting across a set of alternatives, so that I only say that the alternatives are from A to B or from N to Q or whatever it is, and I don't predict the possibility from N to Q of Z or of A occurring, because I say that these events are impossible in terms of the field of alternatives which I'm considering. However, I don't know why it is, but in history what happens is very often not even in the field of the predictable. In other words, it's not even it's not even either position or velocity or, Lamarckian or this or that. It's not even in the field of the predictable in any way. And I don't know whether that's a consequence, and this would be also of our being complex organisms. In other words, does the complexity of the organism lead to a lesser degree of determination? I'm just trying to grasp at straws because I don't really know why that is, but I do know that I'm always struck by the complete lack of capacity. Look, do you know what's going to happen in 20 years? Can you tell me anything about it? He'll be retired. Even that may not happen. They may change the retirement law. They're doing it. They did it in the U.S. and they're doing it in Israel. So, so it's even that is, there's some chance that the day before he retires, they'll say there's no more mandatory retirement in Switzerland. And so, what I'm trying to say is that that what I'm struck by in history is how little explanatory value these Lamarckian or contextual interpretations have for decisive, what I would call decisive events. Because there's something about an event that happens. People march on the Bastille, they execute the king, and once they execute the king, they can't put back his head on his shoulder body. It's over. And I think that's, I won't go on. Okay.
That's again for the single event.
Yes, but I think that if you do concatenations of events, then these are, I get an uneasy feeling because I think these concatenations of events are often categories that we have invented. And the categories, I'll give you a controversial example, the history of women. People have, for the last 50 years or 40 years, explored the history of women. And one of the things that they first tried to do was find something about the consciousness of women in 16th century England. But the problem is that most women in 16th century England did not think as women. They thought as members of their social categories, of their families, whether they were aristocrats, whether they were this or that, So that to get a gender consciousness or a gender category there is something that is sort of very far-fetched. And I wonder sometimes about some of the things that we do in things that are harder sciences if they're not just as far-fetched.
Go ahead.
Isn't that another implication? So how do we know how women thought in the...
Oh, we can read their letters. We read their letters. There are thousands of letters. You can read their letters, and you can do a study, and there are many valid historical books that are written on this. But the point is that the categories which the historian in this works may not be the right categories. And that's also the problem. Now in evolution, it's not quite as bad because you can show, to some degree, I think, what you can differentiate between what DNA and RNA and what all these do and what epigenesis contributes. All the methylation stuff and all that. And so you can actually demonstrate something different that is discrete. And you can repeat it even, because you can grow it in addition in the laboratory. I wish I could.
At the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned one of our famous, although deceased colleagues, Hegel. And he used to say, as you know, the only thing you can learn from history is that you can't learn anything from history. But that you can learn from history, meaning that you can't really reproduce historical facts. But then if you look at another famous person, a theoretician of both history and science, Giambattista Vico, you find exactly the point you were making, the so-called Vico axiom. It's called verum ipsum factum. True is what you yourself have made, or could make at least. So maybe we are misled. Maybe we are misled by comparing history and natural sciences. We should rather compare history, as Giambattista Vico pointed out, as the paramount of, what human beings can make. They can make history. And technology. That's what our natural scientists can really make. And then you suddenly find out that a lot of experiments are not about observing truth, but about making truth. So suddenly you come, to the same conclusion we just reached, but from a different point of view, that both history and natural sciences, i.e. technology, is about making truth. And I think that's far less misleading than comparing history and natural sciences, which we used to do for the last, 150 years, but still misleading, I think.
Well, I have many things to say about that, and it's, part of it is a difference in emphasis, not a disagreement. The comparison between history and natural science, or between, comes about because of the claims of to exclusive truth of one side or the other, that then the other side feels it has to defend. And so this is the fact that there is a debate, or that there's no debate between the two cultures, or all of this kind of thing, is just something that has been itself a cultural factor in our common culture. So I don't think that it's invalid to ask what is at stake here and why it carries out the way it does. Hegel, of course, thought we couldn't learn from history because he thought we incorporate all of history already. In other words, we already were historical. I mean, I think that's a very, what the Germans would call zweideutig, very, equivocal statement of his, because if you think about it, who was more historical in some way than Hegel, in one sense or another. The point about Vico, I think, is a well-taken point. Thank you.
Hello, Professor Motzkin.
Hi.
Hello?
Yes.
That's good. Hi, thank you. I'd like to start by saying I feel a bit out of my league here as one studying scientific philosophy, but this history stuff is extremely interesting. Saying that, I would like to timidly challenge the notion that human behavior is not predictable. On the basis, I've been recently inspired by the Foundation series written by Isaac Asimov, and the central character in this story is a man who can predict the future of humankind in an intergalactic sort of system based on the fact that he has made a historical philosophy, scientifical philosophy. The boundary is still gray for me, but he's created something he names psychohistory, psychology history, something like that. And the idea here, the argument here is that it can be predicted when one has enough evidence, can make enough measurements, has enough data points. And you made the statement that one could not predict that Hitler came to power, and I completely agree that maybe someone in the 1930s could not have seen that coming. But here in the 21st century, we have a lot more information at our disposal, and this information is growing rapidly, and our ability to record it, access it, analyze it is going through the roof. And I think perhaps it's not so as impossible as it sounds. What do you think?
I disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Look, I didn't say that human behavior is not predictable. Of course it is. Look at all the social sciences. If I enclose each of you in a small room and you start going hungry, at some point you're going to scream. 97% or 99% of people, human behavior is extremely predictable. Decisive human behavior, and this was the point the gentleman raised over there, is not predictable because you don't know which human behavior will turn out to be the valid or the successful or what will happen as a consequence of things. And what you do know is that alternative courses of actions have been excluded. So you don't know what would have happened if Hitler had never been born, or if Gavril's Princip. You know, there were 3 assassins that day. 2 of them missed. He was the 3rd assassin on that day. And so, you know, so think about, he came very close to missing too. So, you know, so it's, and all of history would be very different. Now, what I'm trying to say is that you can get all the data you want in the world. And you can have data, you know, like you can record it. You can have a crazy computer that records the behavior of each particle in the universe, you know, big computer. And it presents all the trajectories of all the particles. And you still are not going to be able to say, and this is where I accept the correction that was made over there, which events are prospectively decisive or what are the consequences. You don't even know, you know, did you vote?
Do what?
Yes, where, in Switzerland or in Germany?
Canada.
Canada, okay. So you've got 3 choices. You've got Harper, you've got this guy for Trudeau, and you've got some guy from the Democratic.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. You've got to choose those 3. Only one of them that you have any experience of is Harper. You have no idea what any of the other guys are going to do the day they're elected, and you can't. And you can get all the data you want in the world, and you can't copy their brains, because it's not even their brains. You could even clone Trudeau. Trudeau gets elected, say he gets a big majority. You have the clone of Trudeau sitting in your office. So you have the genetically identical Trudeau. But what you don't have is the Trudeau who is in office, his circumstances, the decisions he has to make, the concrete way in which he is formed by his experience, how his brain plasticity reacts to the world around him. And you cannot possibly know that because you just don't know what the next thing that's going to happen to you is. Can you predict who you're going to fall in love with? Good luck.
Well, you could predict that. I give the microphone this man now.
Yes.
Thanks. Professor Motzkin, just a simple question. I would like to ask you to comment on the history of science, because there you have all the ingredients like distortions from feminism, for example, nationalities and all that stuff, but you have a corrective medium. You know what is the truth. What do you think about that?
Now, there's a problem, because that's what I was trying to say. You know, if you've asked a very key question, and the question is that you have in science, because you have reduced the field to a certain number of variables, you have a corrective. But suppose that what interests me is the history of illusions or of distortions or of lies. Suppose my subject is not the history of what really happened, just the history of what didn't happen, of all the fake stories, the mythologies that people told about that. Now, is that a valid subject? Of course it is a valid subject of comparison. Yet how do I know that I'm telling the truth about the lies? And so on and so forth, you know. Yet the lies may be more important than the truth. For instance, a lot of people in this world believe in a personal God. This is a big lie, you know. It just really is, and you know, there's nothing to be done about it. But you know, but the biggest thing is most people really believe in one. Most people, 90% of people believe in one. Now you can talk about genetically why that happens, but as a historical fact, that fact is very determinative for history, because you can't understand what is happening in the world right now. And you cannot understand it on socio-economic terms. You have to accept the fact that religious belief is a form, has its own effective validity in the world. You know, it has its own effective validity in the world, and that people are going to act for religious reasons. They're going to, just like any other kinds of reasons. So even if you think like I do that this is a great illusion, and that's where history falls into trouble, because you see, you don't have one story that is a master narrative that you can hang on. Suppose Hitler had won. We would all be telling a very different history, wouldn't we?
And a different science, German physics.
Well, that's a different story. I think there they would have gotten back to regular physics after a while.
Very unlikely.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with him.
I think if he had won, I mean, you make statements that are simply not provable. If he had won, it could have happened that he survives like communism for some time, and then it breaks apart after some time.
We don't know.
And the science has survived both. Right?
Science survives both, but it survives both, and that's what I was trying to claim, because it radically reduces the number of variables under consideration. And because it radically reduces the number of variables under consideration, it has the enormous strength of that reductivity.
Excuse me, you have to take the mic because we record this.
Okay, well, we'll get back to you.
Thanks. Thank you for your excellent talk, which I would say was particularly fascinating, as it was, in my view, completely metaphysical. And I think we need provoking metaphysics today. On the other hand, I was a bit surprised about the picture you gave regarding the natural sciences, and I was also a bit surprised that you seem to assume, if I take you right, that we can have basically concepts in natural sciences that we pursue, and they are sort of stable through history. They don't affect the objects, and they are not depending on the scientist that pursues them. It does not affect the behavior of the object, etc. Maybe you don't need to answer all this. I was wondering, do we need actually a philosophy of science to pursue science? It looks like you, I'm not sure whether you're a historian or a philosopher of history. I have a degree in history, but I also studied philosophy, so I'm interested in both fields. But I certainly understand that you had suffered from Marxism and from Freudianism, and also as Walter Zimmerli pointed out, from Hegel, where we have a very strong telos in the history. But the question again here is, do we really need a philosophy of history to do history?
That's a good question, and I will answer two things. First of all, I didn't, I'm glad to see that the people who come from the natural sciences object vociferously to my characterization of it, because I still think that the whole point of the scientific enterprise is to want to predict what will happen. Because if you can't want to predict what will happen through replicating it, then you're not, I don't understand what scientists are doing. You want to be able to predict that if you run an experiment that you're going to get this result or not that result. You want to be able, and the striving is for a predictable world. Now, of course, because of the results of physics and everything today, many people say we don't want to predict. But then the question would be to them, what is it that you think you are doing, really, if you're no longer predicting? What are you really doing? Are you just describing? What is it that you're doing? Because that was the whole advantage of science for a long time, to want to predict. Now, do we need a philosophy of history or a philosophy of science? As somebody who comes from the field of history originally, I think that not having a philosophy of history is a bad thing, and I'll explain why. I think that not having a philosophy of history is a bad thing because there are certain questions that history can't ask that can only be asked in the philosophy of history. It doesn't mean that the philosophy of history can answer those questions, but there are questions that we have that I think we need to keep in front of our minds because they are asked. Like the question of, does, as this gentleman here was trying to propose, does history follow, in any sense, universal rules? What are universal rules of history? What is it that evolves in history? How are things changing in history? These are things that I think are very important. And the problem with doing individual histories is that, I don't know if you've ever been at many conferences of historians, but there are always these people who will say, you talk about, I don't know what, the lower middle class in India, Pakistan, Canada, Australia, and Mongolia. And so what happens, somebody gets up and he starts talking about the lower middle class in his country and whatever thing he's an expert of. Of course, nobody else can say a word about it, because they don't know anything about his country. They can only criticize the theory because they have no idea of his data set. There's no way for them to have an idea of his data set. And there's no way for them even to say that it's right or wrong. So I think that there is some desire on my part to see, at least in history, big questions asked. Now, In science, and that's what I was trying to say in one word, the relation between the philosophy of science and science is a little different. Because I think science, not all of science, certainly not all the articles that are published, but some scientists do ask the big questions. And if you read books about describe physics or biology, you know, I read lots of popular books about this stuff, then you'll see that these are the big questions. And what I'm suggesting is that philosophers of science don't ask those questions. They ask about the context of discovery or the context of justification or what makes a valid formulated diagram of science and everything else. So that's in a word what I was trying to say, that the philosophy of history has a different relationship to history than the philosophy of science to science, because I think that the philosophy of history, not having a philosophy of history, is a deficiency in our contemporary culture.
All right, our next 3 questions come from this angle here. You want the next one?
Hello, I come from the field of architectural history. And my question regards the relationship between history and the object that you introduced at the beginning, between science and the object and history and the object. Because I have the impression that when you talk about history, you talk about historical facts that historians reconstruct through evidence or documents that are proof of these facts. But in the case, let's say, of buildings, these buildings, they become object of the historian. They can be approached if they still exist. They can be examined with various methods. And so the relationship between, let's say, the text that the historian produces and the object is very, very close. So can you please help me to understand this relationship?
I don't know if I can, but I'll see what I can do with it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's put it this way. I can describe, say I have the cathedral at Chartres, big architectural example. So I can describe this building, but you know, I'm not going to get a good art historical description unless I compare it to other cathedrals, the Romanesque, the Gothic, and everything else. And then I get into a stylistic history. And then I find that there's a transition between styles that's never very clear. And then I write, and as I write about this, I get further and further away from the Chartres Cathedral, and from what makes the Chartres Cathedral phenomenally effective. And of course, what I can write about then is then I go back, and instead of doing the iconography, I write about the spatial relations of the Cathedral of Chartres. And I run into this problem again and again, which is to say that I'm caught in any relationship between the concrete and the abstract, between looking for a new theme. So that's one thing. Second, I would argue that with historians, it's worse, because historians are like architectural historians that are trying to reconstruct buildings of which we only have remnants of the floor, like archaeological buildings. In other words, 99.9% of what happens in human life, even in yours, is not recorded and vanishes together with you. I once had a lawsuit where I was sued, and I had to reconstruct events in the late 1940s. I won the suit. But the point is that to reconstruct them was almost impossible. Almost impossible, because the people were either too old or they'd forgotten, and the documentary evidence was fragmentary, and a lot of money was involved. And so, so my point is that history is about the reconstruction of something on the basis of very bad evidence. And don't be fooled by the historians, because when they write their books, they take this bad evidence and they connect it into a historical narrative. But that historical narrative itself, I don't know how many of you have ever worked in an historical archive. First of all, the archive never answers the questions you come in with. Never. Secondly, you just have to accept that they're not, you come in with, you think they're interested in X. No, they're interested in something completely different from anything you expected. Secondly, you begin to then piece together the letters and make some sort of narrative of events, because you're trying to create a narrative. And then you realize that a significant percentage, and I hate to say whether it's between 10 and 90, I don't know, of what you're doing is filler. It's just connecting things where the connections, God only knows what the connections are. It's like all these books on antiquity. I'll give you an example of what I mean. there's one great power in the modern world that does not have a prime minister, the United States. Now imagine several historians in 5,000 years, and one says to the other, it can't be that the United States didn't have a prime minister. All other great countries had prime ministers. Therefore, we must have lost the historical record, and we can assume that there were historical prime ministers that we can't find in the United States. And that's exactly what goes on. You argue from this probability of 5 out of 6 or 9 out of 10 cases showing that there were prime ministers. There's a lot of fallacious argument in biology, in history, in lots of disciplines that goes exactly that way. If it's true in 95% cases, then it has to be true in 100% of the cases, even though we have no evidence for that. And that's the difference, because if you have real existing unruined buildings, that's a great thing.
Okay, go ahead.
So first, thank you very much for the talk. And then, yeah, you mentioned several times about some authorities which came up and had a big influence into the in history, like Hitler or Stalin or whoever. And you also emphasized the personality influence on history, yes? Because if you mention Hitler, we assume some personality, some kind of certain behaviors or certain...
There you're already assuming things. You're assuming that Hitler had a personality or that he had a certain kind of behavior. You have an idea of human beings. See, I just assume that he had certain... I would put it at a much more nominalistic level. I would say that Hitler had certain attitudes. Mm-hmm. But whether these attitudes were integrable into one personality or not, that I leave to the psychologist. You know, for all I know, Hitler was a person with 5 different inconsistent attitudes. It's very hard to say he had a personality. You know, it's what you can say is that you could reasonably predict the kinds of things he was going to do from what he said he was going to do. So, you know, in other words, what happened was people always say they didn't take him seriously. Now, why is that? Because they never imagined that people do what they're going to do, what they say they're going to do. Since most people never do what they say they're going to do.
So, okay, yeah. My question is basically the other side of it. That don't you think that the given socio-economic situation or other factors are generating, so basically the environment generates the person, and basically if not Hitler, there would have been another person which...
No, I don't. I really don't. But I really don't. I think, as I said, I think that it was a high probability that Germany would have fallen victim to some kind of authoritarian regime, just as Austria did. And I think that that was entirely possible, that a defeated Germany with that tremendous resentment and minority affection for democracy, with the bourgeoisie and the ruling classes not being democratic in any way, would have not been democratic. I don't think that necessarily a Second World War would have resulted. I don't think the Holocaust would have resulted. I don't think any of this would have happened. I think we would have had just another sort of Spanish caudillo state. A couple of million people might have died, but, you know, compared to 100 million, that's, or 50 million, or whatever it was, that's a small number, you know, but they would have all been Germans too. And so, you know, so I think that, no, you can't, that's exactly what I'm saying, that the circumstances do not allow you to predict what's going to happen. And let me put it this way. One of the leading candidate for the Republican nomination for the President of the United States is a certain Donald Trump. Now, suppose by some chance that Donald Trump wins the election. Do you know what Donald Trump is going to do tomorrow? Do you have any idea of how that's going to affect the history of the world? I would be delighted to be enlightened on that topic, because not even sure Mr. Trump knows. But I'll tell you this. But I'll tell you this, that, you know, it's a very fateful thing if Mr. Trump even stands a chance of being elected, for reasons that I cannot. But I can't specify the reasons why it's so fateful. I can just tell you it is. The reason is because I assume that he's going to be wild. Even that I don't know. See, you have no conception, and that's what I'm trying to say. I'll put it in terms of my own politics. We love to hate Bibi Netanyahu in my country. All the intelligentsia hate Bibi Netanyahu, of course. Now, that's a great thing. The point is, Bibi Netanyahu is one of the most cautious prime ministers in terms of doing anything that Israel has ever had. You know, he's always afraid of any course of action at all, and he tries to stay away from doing anything at all, one way or the other. Peace, no peace. He just doesn't want to do anything, and people don't see that. In fact, and that is, I don't know if it's a personality trait or an attribute or a political wisdom or something else. It creates its own political and historical reality, this aversion to in any way interfering with any form of historical process at all. You know, on the basis of somebody who has a reasonable degree of freedom about what he can do. You know, most countries in the world in the Cold War had very little freedom, whether they were in the West or the East, because they were directed by the head partner of their alliance. If you were the German Bundesminister in 1960, you didn't really get to run an independent foreign policy. But Bibi Netanyahu does have freedom, you know, so it's all the more amazing.
Thanks. I would like, in a way, to come back to the question that was asked from the first row. And I would like to ask whether you think that the history that is happening today, the history of the future, in a way, like that will be seen from the future, is different from the history in the past. And one property of this history could be that it would be less chaotic, that single events have such a huge influence because of the stabilizing influence of the technology, like, you know, the communication technology, that we learn about events quickly and that we can respond to them on a global level.
I wish I shared your nice belief. I'll put it this way. You know, there's this guy, I can't remember his name, who's the head of the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi or whatever he's called. Now, 10 years ago, you would not find one person who would have predicted the rise of the Islamic State. Not one. In all the field of Islamic scholarship in the world, not one person would have predicted that, and not one person would have predicted the specific policies about women, about slaves, about everything else that al-Baghdadi has undertaken, you know. And I think that this is really true. You know, actually people did predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I remember talking to people who did. They never gave the reason why it eventually fell. They did predict that it would collapse, but it was going to be the nationalities problem. That was one prediction I heard, all kinds of things. And they were a vanishingly small minority of Sovietologists. Like I can only remember two who predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years in advance. I didn't know about that. I was thinking of Hélène Carrère-Dancous and Reggie Zelnick at the University of California at Berkeley, actually, the two that I can think of. So maybe there were more, you know, that I don't know about. Yes, go ahead. Like this.
But I wonder, this technology I'm talking about is younger than that, right? It's less than 5 years that we have all these, you know, Facebooks and YouTubes, and also the machine learning techniques that allow.
Why do you think that leads to greater predictability?
Because the information can be spread more quickly in official and unofficial channels, and also, like you and all the structures, they allow us to react more quickly. Like if you look at the events that happen now.
But let me give you an analogy from biology. Assume that there is some mechanism by which the rate of gene transfer accelerates between lateral gene transfer in bacteria or, you know, genetic development or whatever it is. Assume that there's, for some reasons we don't understand, a higher rate of mutation, higher rate of this. Do you think that the acceleration of the rate of gene transfer creates more predictability? I would suggest the biologists would agree that the more gene transfer you have, the less predictability you have of what's going to happen, because you just have more transfer, so you have many more chances of a beneficial mutation or something like that, or of something changing, so that the more predictability you have. Actually, social networks, I would say, create a situation of less predictability, not more predictability.
I think you're right about the predictability, but about the control. It's easier to control a system and prevent it from being chaotic if you have fast feedback loops that allows you to control the system. Even something unpredictable happens, we can dampen it because we have.
But maybe you don't want to. See, how do you know what you want to? You see, that the point is this. You see, you're suggesting that unpredictability, this is a totalitarian fantasy by which we should predict. You know, basically, you know, I think that human beings have done very well out of the unpredictability of things, not out of the predictability of things. We wouldn't be where we were at the top of the food chain if things had been predictable. The tigers would have beaten us cold. You know?
All right, last question. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else wants to?
They're getting tired.
Okay. Then, first of all, thanks for coming, and I do hope that you were able to extract meaning from this event. And thanks for coming here. And please
thank you all very much for listening.
And applauding Mr. Motzkin.